All right, I'll go ahead and start kind of doing the introductions. So welcome to everyone who has joined so far. This webinar is being hosted as part of Open Classroom, which is the Brown School's virtual and free professional development series. Brown School Professional Development is the largest provider of continuing education units in Missouri. So if you're looking for CEUs or just some deeper learning, please check out the Professional Development Open Classroom website, which we have added to the chat. The Professional Development Department offers workshops year-round on a near weekly basis. So as I said, we are using a Zoom webinar format, which means we can't see or hear you, but we can and do really want to engage with you through the chat box. So please introduce yourself, share where you're joining from, and add any comments or questions in the chat box as we go along throughout this panel. We will have time for some questions towards the end of the session. So feel free to leave them there throughout the session, and we'll get to a few of those at the end. All right, welcome to the third session of the SALaMA Webinar Series. This session focuses on mental health and psychosocial well-being of newcomer, immigrant, and refugee adolescents, whether that be newcomers to the US or just to different contexts globally. So the study of adolescent lives after migration to America, or SALaMA, is a mixed method study conducted by Washington University in St. Louis with support from Qatar Foundation International, or QFI. SALaMA seeks to better understand the experiences and psychosocial well-being of in-school adolescents with a focus on immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers from the Middle East and North Africa region who are living in the US. The purpose of this webinar series is to disseminate our study findings and also to engage with educators, practitioners, researchers, and policymakers who are committed to supporting immigrant and refugee student populations around the world. SALaMA is supported by Qatar Foundation International, or QFI. QFI is an international organization that advances Arabic language education around the world. They are currently operating in the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Italy. And QFI supports Arabic language programs and works to increase access to Arabic instruction for educators and students around the world. For those of you joining us for the first time, we encourage you to watch our first two sessions of the SALaMA Webinar Series, which focused on multilingual learning and programs. So we have a really wonderful panel lined up for today's session. Please note that the panel will share insights and experiences from their work in research, practice, and policy with immigrant and refugee youth. These views may not represent the entire field of mental health work with newcomer students. So if you're interested in this topic, we encourage you to do your own additional research following the session. And now I would like to introduce our moderator for today. Mitra Naseh is an early career forced migration scholar. She is an assistant professor and research director of the Initiative on Social Work and Forced Migration at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. Naseh's research focuses on refugees' social and economic integration from a multidimensional perspective. Her work and research are rooted in and guided by her previous professional work experience as a staff member of non-governmental organizations and the United Nations in the Middle East and South Asia. Over to you, Mitra.
Thank you, Ali. I will briefly introduce the panel members, and then we have some questions that we have for them, and then we will move to Q&A with the participants. I go alphabetically and start with Ana Arias, who is a licensed professional counselor for the Commonwealth of Virginia and has been working in the mental health field for the last 20 years. Ana received her master's and education specialist degree in counseling at James Madison University. Ana's training and specialization is in the field of trauma and how that affects children, families, and communities. Ana is also an immigrant. She arrived in the United States at the age of 17. She was born and raised in Brazil. Her father is from Panama, and her mother is American. Ana is fluent in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and specializes in working with children and families from other countries and the mental health dynamics associated with immigration and cultural adaptation. And we are so happy that you are with us today. Next, we have Najat Qushua, who is a research data analyst at Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. Najat has worked for over 15 years as a social worker in psychiatric hospital and community mental health centers in Jerusalem, Israel. Najat's dissertation project and doctoral work focused on mothering experiences in the aftermath of war and displacement. Specifically, she's interested in researching mothering, gender dynamics, violence, health, and mental health of refugee and immigrant women and girls in Arab Muslim societies, refugee camps, host communities, and camps in Western countries and low resources settings. Thank you for being with us today, Najat. We also have Patricia Landínez with us, who is originally from Colombia. She's a psychologist and trained art therapist. Patricia has in-depth experience in international development and humanitarian assistance with more than 15 years of progressive professional experience working in complex emergency and development contexts in Asia, Africa, and America. Her work in this field has been concerned with designing, developing, and managing programs aiming to strengthen the resilience of children and adolescents who have been confronted with great adversities. Currently, Patricia works with the UNICEF education team in New York headquarters, supporting integrating mental health and psychosocial support programs for students and teachers within the education sector. Thank you for being with us today, Patricia. And we also have Ken Miller, who is the Edith Lando Professor of Counselling for Refugee and Immigrant Youth and Families at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He's a clinical psychologist with postdoctoral training in prevention, science, and community mental health. The focus of his research has been on understanding the pathways by which armed conflict and forced migration impact mental health and developing cultural grounded mental health intervention for conflict-affected populations. Most recently, Ken was the PI of a multi-year project developing and evaluating a caregiver support intervention, a 9-session group intervention aimed at strengthening the well-being and partnering of Syrian refugee caregivers in Lebanon. The caregiver support intervention prioritizes caregiver well-being as a key pathway to strengthening parenting. This intervention is currently being scaled up in other Middle Eastern countries, countries that are Arabic-speaking in the Middle East region. Ken's interests are now in adopting the caregiver support intervention for use with refugee families in high-income countries, a reverse of the usual flow of knowledge from high to low and middle-income countries, which is fascinating. Thank you for being with us today, Ken. And to start the questions, Anna, can we have your perspective on what are some of the unique challenges and strengths for immigrant and refugee youth when it comes to mental health and psychosocial well-being?
Absolutely. And thank you for hosting this, and thank you for having this important dialogue and conversation. I think it's imperative for our world to be talking about these youth who have special needs for mental health considerations. I do think that one of the unique challenges and strengths of a first generation immigrant teenager is biculturalism. It is a great asset. There's a lot of research on how adaptable and how better problem solvers, more creative people who are bicultural are. However, it is a very unique challenge if, as a first generation immigrant adolescent, you start to shift from the culture of your family to the bicultural reality of living as in a developing individual in a new culture. And one of the challenges that that brings up is that separation then between the parents and their culture and their values and their language, and then the adolescent, which if we know about what is the most important defining job for a teenager is to figure out who they are. So now they're figuring out who they are in a new culture. And so they're learning to identify themselves not only using their parents and their ancestors' culture, but their peers' culture. And this is especially true for MENA youth who are females, because there is a lot of pressure to be confined in the homes, to isolate, and the parents want to protect, but that is very different from the American culture, dominant culture of individualism. And so you have these young women who are creating friendships and who have access to social media, so they are not as confined as their parents think they are in their homes, and are starting to want to relate and want to adapt and want to take on some of the dominant culture aspects that their friends have. And for some families, that is viewed as disrespectful, as rejecting. And so then you have the conflict between the adolescent youth and the parents. And then you have this growing gap, which is very sad, because the collectivistic culture, which is a strength of these young individuals, starts to break apart. So whereas the strength is the collectivism, where family is so important, how they view themselves as part of a system is so important, and then that starts to disintegrate as they start to become bicultural and their parents don't understand or support that shift. There's a lot of tension there, and can create also a lot of mental health issues. A lot of these young women are at risk for running away, for having symptoms of depression and anxiety, and for having to choose between their parents and their peers, which is not a situation you want to put a teenager in. So those are just some challenges that are unique to this population that I know of. And also the fact that their parents are at the same time dealing with their own stressors. So they're not always available to help the teenagers maneuver through becoming bicultural, which, by the way, no one teaches you. When I came at 17 and had to discover how to become bicultural, no one sits down and teaches you, this is how you become bicultural. You figure it out the hard way. The strength of that, the beauty of that, is you are able to become more adaptable and understand what part of your culture you want to use and when. But that's a stressful learning experience and a stressful journey, especially if your parents don't understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. The other unique challenge for this population is role reversal. So what we know is that the first generation youth are learning language faster than their parents are learning. And so they're coming in and they're able, because of schooling, because of just the way the brain is with gaining knowledge, it's easier to learn a language at a young age. Now you have children who have a better grasp of the English language than their parents do. So in a traditional family where there is a very strict power differentiation between authority and those in authority, well, now you have children who have more social power in a way than you do as a parent. And that can cause a lot of problems in the family, and also just disconnection, because there is a lot of pressure, parents wanting the child to hold on to their own language, children wanting to fit in and really focus on English, and that disconnect can become a mental health issue for the entire family, especially if no one is guiding them in how to have these conversations, and how all of this can be a journey that they take together as a family, as opposed to the conflict that it often becomes.
Thank you, Anna. Patricia, can we hear your perspective about some of the strength and challenges when it comes to psychosocial well-being of immigrant and refugee youth? Anna mentioned culture, the concept of culture, role reversal, parental stress. We would love to hear your perspective on that.
Thank you, Mitra. And in addition to and thank you for the invitation for this panel. I'm really pleased to be talking about the importance of the mental health of migrant and refugee children. And in addition to Anna, I would like to focus more on a global perspective. And I think I will start by sharing with you some data estimates that will give you a picture of what is happening at the global level. So by mid-2022, and this is data from UNHCR, an estimate of 103 million people have been forcibly displaced from their homes due to persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, and climate change. And of those, 40 million are children. And in this data, this amount does not include the estimated 3.9 million of Ukraine refugee children, and also 4.1 million children that are displaced inside Ukraine. And I would like to explain, UNICEF, when talking about refugees and migrants, we use an umbrella term to talk about children on the move, who are children who are migrating or forcibly displaced within their country or across borders. Children migrating on their own, so we also call them unaccompanied children, or children migrating with the family and caregivers, children who move undocumented or documented, children affected by migration, such as children left behind because parents migrated for work and they want to join it. And of course, it's important to note for us, the unaccompanied children are the children the most vulnerable from all migrants, because they face several challenges through the migration journey without the support of their caregivers or an adult they trust. And of course, children migrate for multiple reasons. There are some that migrate because they're looking for better opportunities for education or work. There are some that are looking for reunification with their families and caregivers, and there are many others that also escape violence and persecution, and many others. There's a mixture of everything together. But regardless of the reasons of leaving home, many find that the experience of migration profoundly impacts their mental health. And however, the mental health and the impact of the migration on children's mental health involve a complex mix of risks, and the effect of this risk can vary according from child to child, depending on the age, development stage, how they normally react to stress, if they have a past history of mental health condition, or if the parents also had a past history of any type of mental health conditions, whether they're traveling alone or with caregivers, and whether they access some type of support. So, it's also important to know that they often face very extreme hardships in their countries of origin, in transit, and also many times in countries of destinations. They are left alone. They're often separated from parents or caregivers and family. They are exposed to violence, exploitation, abuse, trafficking, smuggling, and they often see the access to services disrupted, such as health and education. They're often detained also in migration detention centers for days, weeks, or years. They also are facing social exclusion and discrimination, sometimes the lack of legal identity and legal status. For some, sadly, the outcome of migration is disappearance or death. And it is also important that the lack of information, to mention the lack of information or uncertainty, the changing policies, and undignified treatment also add additional stress to children and their families. Many migrants and refugees will experience distress, feelings of anxiety, sadness, hopelessness, difficulties sleeping, fatigue, anger, pain, but for most people, this reaction may improve over time. But for some, the mental health outcome of the migration journey can be very different. And studies from WHO show that the prevalence of common mental health disorders such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorders is higher among refugees and migrants if we compare with host communities or host populations. And asylum seekers tend to be at elevated risk of suicide. And after saying all that, it's also important to consider that the narrative of those children and adolescents are also full of resilience, and they also show an incredible ability to adapt to this difficult situation. They also have a very strong sense of purpose and to look for the inspiration and sometimes the motivation that took them to migrate and to look for a better future. And it is also very important to know for, in any country or for services that the way children on the move receive services and how protection, assistance, and support are provided make a great difference in their life and, of course, in the impact that it can have on their own mental health and well-being. So this was very general, not focused on a specific population, but just general characteristics of children on the move that could be. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Patricia. It was great to have more global perspective as well. So lots of challenges and strong resiliency among the population. Najat, you have background in providing services. Can we ask you to give us some perspective about some strategies to better engage families and communities in supporting the well-being of immigrant and refugee as adolescent and youth?
Yeah, thank you. I will talk about some of our findings from the SALaMA study, about some strategies that caregivers shared with us, strategies that they recommend or they implemented, both. So service providers highly recommended community outreach programs, services directed toward parents. So Ken maybe can elaborate on this point, and individual communication with parents and families. And here I want to share, like Anna, some small anecdote from my personal experience. 8 years ago, when I arrived to the United States, after 1 month receiving so many emails and written documents from the school, I decided to leave and go back home. It is, and I wish I had some kind of individual communication directly with me, with someone who understands my language. That would make my immigration experience much different and easier. So this is one of the strategies that caregiver service providers shared with us. They highly encourage outreach programs and parent interventions to improve community engagement. They also encourage community-informed programs. They recommend to involve parents in designing and implementing the interventions, so they can feel part of it and more of a partners than population that Western people or the host community tries to impose programs or treatments on them. Another thing that they shared with us from their experience is they highly encourage direct communications with family, As I said, they said that they are trying to implement a method of communication to better appeal to MENA families and the communities. They are trying to tailor their word and phrase choices when speaking of this population. For instance, they trying to avoid using words like mental health or therapy and replace it with more acceptable words like trauma and stress. They also highly encourage to discuss the benefits of therapy with parents, specifically in stressing how that will improve their kids' grades. I agree. As a mother, if someone give me a method or advice how to improve my kids' grade, I will take it. So this is one of the strategies they use. And another strategy they use the language of physical health, trying to, for instance, talking about mental distress, illness, or suffering as a cavity in the teeth, and how to deal with it. That we must to take care of the cavity so the problem does not accelerate. These are some of the insights from our SALaMA study. As a social worker, I agree with most of the recommendations or the strategies they applied. I think that it's highly important to outreach and for parents, and do it constantly and trying to overcome the language barrier. Another thing that they highlighted the significance of building trust with the parents and families. And it's not an easy thing to building relationships with immigrant and refugee families. We need to build a safe space, to create a safe space for them to share their stories, that many of the stories are traumatic, and including suffering and personal disclosure of their story. To foster this safe space, service providers highly stressed the need to privacy and confidentiality. Among MENA communities, this is not just MENA communities, but it is a sensitive matter in MENA communities because of the focus on reputation and the families' demand from their children to maintain a good reputation. Reputation is a concept, it's an honor culture that maintaining a good name or a positive reputation is very, very important, specifically, as Anna mentioned, for girls, because marriage and establishing family is central. It's still central among MENA communities, and families do not want any damage for their specifically girls' reputation, because a girl who's known as receiving psychiatric treatment or psychological treatment for mental illness or mental distress, that will hurt her marriage prospects.
Thank you, Najat. And as you suggested, I'm going to ask for Ken's feedback. Ken, you have years of experience engaging with the community, and in your research project, in your recent project, Career Support Intervention, you're actually reversing the game. You are now bringing what is working in low-income countries to to the US. What are some of the strategies that you are using to engage with the families and youth and adolescent immigrants and refugees?
Well, to be clear, that's the plan. We haven't begun. The first part of what we're involved with now is just planning out this first phase of the research, just to find out if it's even needed. We never want to implement an intervention without first finding out, A, is there a need for it, and B, how does it need to be adapted for this context here in Greater Vancouver. Where the caregiver support intervention, just briefly, it's I was working at a Dutch nonprofit, War Child Holland, before moving here last year. And years ago at War Child, we wanted to add a parenting intervention to our toolbox. And there's a lot of research showing that for children and youth, one of the biggest sources of stress for refugee children and youth, and conflict-affected kids and youth, the biggest sources of stress aren't just whatever they've been through, back in the country of origin, which has been the focus of a lot of research and intervention, healing war trauma and war-related distress. But actually what's going on in the here and now in their families turns out to be a major source of either protection or stress for youth, for kids. When parents are highly stressed or highly distressed, that really can compromise or undermine their parenting. And that in turn affects kids' well-being. And it's really only in the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years that humanitarian organizations and researchers have begun realizing that we were so focused on healing war trauma that we were sending kids back to, they'd get involved in some kind of cool 1.5 hour, 2 hour activity, and then they'd go back home to high levels of stressors, and that we really needed to pay attention to supporting families. So anyway, at War Child, when we were looking around for interventions focused on parents, caregivers, the thing that I think my colleague Mark Jordans and I were really kind of shocked by was that so many of the existing interventions, they saw this link between compromised parenting and kids' mental health issues. But instead of addressing caregivers' own needs for stress management, their own well-being, their own psychosocial support, they came in with these interventions that just assumed that parents didn't know how to parent. The focus was on parenting knowledge and skills. Largely overlooking the fact that stress might have been compromising parents' ability to use all of the knowledge and skills that they already had. The single most commonly used parenting program throughout much of the humanitarian world, certainly in the Middle East where I was working, had 10 sessions, half of one session focused on caregiver stress. The message is so clear that caregiver stress just wasn't a priority. And implicit in that, and this is what led to us to develop the caregiver support program, was implicit in that is that this idea that parents just don't know better, and we need to come in and teach them how to parent. And I was deeply uncomfortable with that idea. I assumed that Palestinian parents or Syrian parents or parents anywhere know as much or as little as parents anywhere. And certainly we can all benefit from exposure, from learning evidence-based concepts of, effective parenting and discipline and nurturing and support. But we also need to help parents deal with their own well-being. And that was the driving idea. And when we created the CSI, or the Caregiver Support Intervention, the first four sessions of the 9 sessions just focus on caregivers' own well-being and cultivating stress management and exercises that they practice a lot and that we use, and focusing on anger management and frustration management and building social support within the group. And then we layer on some of the positive parenting stuff at the end. And this approach assumes that parents have a great deal of knowledge and skill already, and that the stress and distress they're feeling is getting in the way of that. And that when we can help lower that, sure enough, what we see is significant reductions in harsh parenting. We see changes in the amount of patience parents bring. We see greater engagement of fathers in their young children's lives. And we actually see improvements in the marriage, even though we don't focus on that. As parents feel better, they connect more powerfully. All of these things then show downstream effects on improved mental health in kids. So it's a long way of saying that one avenue that I'm particularly interested in for strengthening the well-being of refugee kids is strengthening the well-being of refugee parents, or whoever the caregivers are. When kids come home to a supportive, engaged, nurturing home life, they're going to do better. That's certainly true with very young children whose brains are still evolving a mile a minute and who are much more dependent on the family environment. But I think this is true throughout childhood. And so that's not the only way in. There's lots of ways of reaching refugee kids, particularly as they get older and are out of the home more. You've got school-based activities, community activities, but the parenting path is what I'm most interested in. Since we developed the CSI first in Palestine and then in Lebanon with Syrian refugees, the question here for me in Canada is, where there's so many more resources available to parents, what are the needs? Is there a role for this sort of intervention in a more highly resourced setting? And that's the research that we're looking into now. One thing that's really clear here is parents have two primary concerns that we're already beginning to hear about. One has to do with a fear of losing their children due to any kind of harsh parenting. You simply don't have a child protective service system in a lot of the Middle East that comes in and removes children, when there's any kind of hitting, in a way that in Canada there's real risk of. And parents are very frightened of that. It even makes asking about it very sensitive and difficult. The other thing is that parents are expected here in high-income countries to play a really active role in their kids' education. And that is very different in many parts of the world. Certainly, I got my start in Mexico and Guatemala. Parents are not expected to play that same active role in many parts of Central America. In fact, it's disrespectful to get too involved because that's the teacher's domain. So part of what I think parents need help with is understanding that they really need to become advocates for their kids' education here in a way that may differ from what they're used to back home. But we're really just in the early phase now of exploring the role of a parent support intervention here in Canada.
Thank you. Fascinating. So we talked about some strategies to engage, and it's fascinating to learn more about CSI. Anna, back to you. Can you share some therapeutic modalities that resonate with newcomer students, particularly those who have experienced different forms of trauma during migration? We are a bit over time, so I would appreciate a short response to a very broad question that I am asking you.
So I have been working as a therapist in the field of trauma for 20 years, and it has changed so much. So I love that you said, answer this quickly, because we have gone in very different directions as to what works for trauma. So in a nutshell, back in the day, there was a belief that some people still hold that people who have trauma histories need this cathartic expression. They need to talk about the trauma and then they can go and they will get better. That is actually no longer the the way that trauma is approached right now. The most recent research is talking about talk therapy is actually not a great modality for trauma across the board. So that also includes immigrants coming in. So this like need for disclosure needs to be a myth that is taken off the table, because what you can do is re-traumatize, re-trigger, and cause more problems and open up a can of worms that is not ready, that they don't have the coping skills to deal with. So what we are finding in the world of trauma is that we want to take away the parts of the frontal lobe, so the talking part of it, the trying to make sense part of it. And before even going there, that's a higher level of trying to understand your trauma history. We are looking at expressive therapies as being the best and most efficient modality. So we're talking about movement. If you are interested in treating trauma and you don't know Bessel van der Kolk, you need to look him up. He talks about how trauma is stored in the body. Therefore, the response to trauma needs to be a body response. Play therapy, art therapy, and once again, not just any kind of play therapy or art therapy, but trauma-informed play therapy. So there is training that you can specifically get to be trauma-informed expression therapist, and that's what you're looking for. Once again, I agree with what Ken said, that you can't take the kid out of the family and just, work with the child. There's so many layers there. And I also agree with what also was said about you can't come at it as a mental illness with immigrant families. That's in my country, that would shut you down so fast. You have to come at it as you've been through really hard things that are affecting your ability to function. And so we're going to work on some skills to help you be able to function in a better way so that you can achieve the goals that you came to the United States to achieve. And that feels more palpable, especially because our immigrant youth do somaticize their mental health issues. And so a lot of it will be manifested in somatic complaints, which once again is the beauty of expressive therapy and movement therapy. So I could talk for days about that, but I won't because I was told not to. But you can also look into, if you are interested in some of the newer modalities that are working, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, also known as EMDR, is having a lot of success with especially specific traumatic events. So PTSD is a little bit tricky that way, especially if you're coming from a lot of environmental trauma, but we are seeing a lot of success in the field of EMDR and trauma work. I talked really fast. I hope that made sense.
Thank you, Anna, and such important information. Thank you so much for sharing. I was fascinated with learning about these new expressive therapies. And the last question, from the panel, and we have less than a minute or a couple minutes. Patricia, can we hear from you about how can educational settings be more culturally responsive in their approaches to mental health and psychosocial care?
Thank you very much. And I will try to summarize as fast as I can some of the best practices that are coming from UNICEF policy frameworks, advocacy, and programming best practices. And perhaps not all of them are important in high-income countries, but I think it's important to consider at the global level also what is happening. So the first one is to make sure children and refugees and all type of children on the move have access to education. In many countries, this is not possible because there are some barriers that are related with the nationality, citizenships, the migration status, and also we advocate for the removal of these legal or administrative barriers to make sure children really have access to school. Another key action, I think, that was mentioned by Najat is that we can also invite parents, teachers, and migrants themselves to support us support us in designing those programs they will also benefit from, and that we can gain a lot from their own experience and they have had in the past participating in those programs, or the newcomers also can be a great value and add to the discussion on what's best for them when that is possible. Another, I think, very key action is to make sure that the caregivers and children themselves, they have access to the information. This is a great, that produces a lot of stress for children where they don't have, or families, information about the services that are available and the rights they have and how and when to access these services, school or health services. And this is also very important to have very specialized services, especially for those children that are the most vulnerable. So those children that travel unaccompanied and those children that we identified as being victims of any type of violence during the migration journey. So we need to make sure that in education and health services, there are specific age and gender and culturally appropriate services to support their needs. And it's also important to consider, some specialized care for those children with disabilities that are also on the move. Also mentioned by Najat, in education is very important with any type of center that is receiving children on the move, that they receive training in their own language, while they also receive support to learn the new language. And this is, support this transition between the previous education, if they had access to this education service, and the new education system, and also create some remedial programs. So closing the gap between what students know from the country and what they expected to know in the new country, and how to focus specifically on the literacy and numeracy and the socio-emotional skills of the children that are coming to a new country. It is also very recommended to recruit teachers and to support them with training who have similar cultural and linguistic backgrounds. So in our experience, that results in lower rates of dropout, and also support the cultural and social transition into host communities. Also, providing, not every teacher has the understanding and the skills to understand what are the stressors and the situation of children on the move. So they could be also receive some support and training, but not only training, but also those in the education sector or health sector that are working with children on the move should also be recipients of some type of mechanism and support for their own mental health and process all what they are seeing and receiving in the work they're doing. And also it's very important to build the capacity of the authorities and the health services. So they are familiar with the countries and backgrounds of the children of the move they're working with. I think it's also very important, especially in school, to leverage the role of sports, recreation, and arts, not only for the therapeutic impact, but also that because that helps in schools with social cohesion between the children on the move and also children in host communities. And last but not least, it is also very important to work around the stigma that it is attached to mental health condition, but also the stigma and racism and xenophobia that sometimes exist. And it is also present in schools, but also in the services where children on the move are having services. And this is not comprehensive, but I'm happy to share some documents or respond any questions or after the webinar. I'm sorry to be too long.
No, that was very important. Thank you. Thank you for the information. And so our audience now know if they have further questions, they can post it in a chat. So about this last question, I also want to hear from Najat, and after that from Ken. In your experience working with immigrants and refugee youth, what are some strategies to that you want to share with us about how can educational setting will be more culturally responsive. Najat, we would love to hear from you. You're muted.
Yes, so Patricia touched many of the important points to look for strategies to overcome stigma. This is very important. From our findings, service providers shared that it's very important to build cultural competencies among mental health providers and educators, including educating school staff, providing home liaison services, increasing MENA representation among providers, and offering language interpretation resources. So this is in general. They stressed the importance of the important role homeschool liaisons play, and sometimes they said that homeschool liaisons are the first responder to mental health problems among school students. Again, I will go back to the confidentiality issue, that one way to address this concern, which is a huge concern among MENA parents and communities, is to hold the service in not in a specialized building, that everyone knows that you are going to the psychiatric clinic or to receive treatment in a specific clinic. It might be worth to think to include it in school. The school-based therapist might be one way to go, or to incorporate it within primary health care or other buildings that provide services that not stigmatized as mental health. Another thing that Anna touched, another issue, it's very important to understand the family structure in Middle Eastern and North African communities. As Anna mentioned, the collectivistic part versus the individualistic culture. So it might be sometimes youth and the children in Middle Eastern and North African countries, the priority is their parents and their family happiness over their own. So to keep this balance between their individual desires and wishes and dreams and worldviews and their families, it's a very important point to stress in therapy. And this is, yeah.
Thank you, Najat. Thank you. And last but not least, can you share some of the strategies that you're using in your work or you want to share with the participants about having more culturally appropriate educational settings?
Well, I mean, you know, when I'm thinking about, if we're thinking about educational settings being supportive to you know, refugee youth in particular, newcomer youth, one of the strongest findings from the research is that discrimination is one of the most powerful stressors that refugee youth face in the community. And by community, I include the school community. And so moving away from formal mental health services for a moment, one of the really cool things about mental health is that you can improve mental health or protect mental health in a lot of ways that don't involve actual mental health care. Mental health care is, in public health language, is sort of a downstream. It's sort of, it's what you do when other things aren't working. But if we think about something like discriminatory attitudes towards kids from the MENA region in, say, in the US, we know that this is one of the most powerful sources of depression and anxiety that kids experience. So putting them in therapy is fine, except if they're going back to an environment that keeps generating these experiences. Therapy, you know, it's a temporary solution that's really not going to address what's going on that's driving the distress. So I think one of the most powerful things we can do is work at a whole school level to really very preventatively foster attitudes that are accepting and knowledgeable and counter some of the really dangerous toxic narratives that are going around about, you know, Middle Easterners. And this, I think, really hits Middle Eastern male youth who are portrayed as young terrorists in the media constantly. And so that can create all kinds of distress and defensiveness and anxiety. I think there are all kinds of programs that educators, school personnel can be engaged in that can foster attitudes of acceptance and inclusion. But it begins by helping them look at some of their own stereotypes and their own beliefs that may be getting in the way. Because we want to make sure that our educators are not contributing to the discriminatory attitudes, even unwittingly, that kids may experience. And then there really do need to be kind of school-wide programs that just foster inclusion and work against discriminatory attitudes. Now, this isn't to say there isn't an important role for mental health services that are culturally sensitive and minimize any kind of stigma. There's some really nice examples of school-based mental health services for refugee youth, certainly in the Boston area, that have shown really good effects and minimize stigma because they're located sort of in a very thoughtful way within school settings. But I think making school a safe and supportive place is a really important starting point.
Thank you. And that was a very important point to add. We have around 3 minutes and maybe time for one question. I also saw that Patricia already sent some resources. So I'm going to ask the first question that was summarized here for me. And it says, do you have findings or strategies that promote the engagement of guardians of unaccompanied minors, particularly when time is limited for guardians due to carrying multiple jobs? And we welcome whoever has some answers about these questions.
I will say, if I can jump in, one of the things when we were trying to involve fathers in the caregiver support program in North Lebanon, everyone said that's a fool's errand. You will never get men involved in this kind of programming. But we did, and we were successful, but we didn't, it's not because we were smarter than anyone or more creative. We asked people, why don't men get involved? And one of the biggest answers was, we got to work, we got to make money. We can't come in and do psychosocial support stuff if it's a choice between not feeding our families and, you know, and or not. So what we did, and this is a challenge for organizations, is we figured out when are the days and the times when we can offer programming that's least likely to conflict with income generation opportunities. And that's when we offered the programming. And what we found was, by doing that, men came and they kept coming. It became very important to them that it wasn't so much a thing of men won't get involved in anything to do with caregivers. Actually, that was more of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Humanitarian organizations weren't trying to get men because they didn't think men would participate. And if you don't try and get them, they certainly won't participate. If you can offer programming at hours that don't conflict with income generation, I think that is one of the most important things that we can do. That's a challenge, of course. I realize the logistics of that, because sometimes that means offering programming at hours that, you know, a lot of folks don't generally work. in community-based organizations and, or, you know, and anything, certainly in school settings. So it is a challenge. If you want to get folks involved, caregivers of unaccompanied youth who are carrying multiple jobs, you have to figure out through conversations with them how to schedule that. But then you also have to realistically see, what will your staff do? Can you get folks who will work those hours? In my experience, the answer is yes, but it takes a little bit of doing.
Thank you, Ken. And Ali, the floor is yours for closing.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to our amazing panelists for all these great insights in global context, domestic context, and for our wonderful moderator for leading this session. As a reminder, we'll be posting a recording of this program on the Brown Schools Open Classroom YouTube channel, where you can also find past sessions from the SALaMA Webinar Series, as well as over 200 open classroom webinars on other social work and public health topics. These are all for free and available, so please check them out. And you can go ahead and look in the chat, where I see we also had an addition from Najat, helping with transportation costs for families. So thank you for adding that. Thank you all for joining. And we hope you'll join us next time for the rest of the SALaMA Webinar Series.